You're not changing, at least not in the way people usually mean when they say that. Nothing dramatic, nothing sudden, no moment where everything flips and becomes unrecognizable. But something is different, and if you're here listening, you may have already noticed it, not as a thought, but as a quiet shift in how the world seems to respond to you. Stay with that for a moment, because this isn't about improvement. It isn't about becoming more or better or elevated above anything else. It's about perspective, about observation, about what happens when attention changes before behavior ever does. Most people assume change begins internally, then moves outward, that you decide, act, transform, and the world follows. But observation doesn't work that way. Observation works silently. It works before language, before conclusions, before you even decide that something matters. And when observation changes, response changes with it. Not because you demanded it, not because you earned it, but because systems, human, social, perceptual, respond differently to what is seen differently. You don't need to be special for this to be true. You don't need to stand out. You don't need to claim insight. This happens to anyone who begins paying attention without rushing to define what they see. If you've ever felt like people react to you differently lately, without being able to explain why, if conversations seem to pause a fraction longer than they used to, if situations resolve with less friction or sometimes more clarity without extra effort, that doesn't mean you changed. It may mean the way you are being observed has shifted, and that distinction matters, because observation is not judgment, it's not praise, it's not surveillance in the dramatic sense, it's interpretation. Every system, whether it's a person, a group, or an environment, filters what it notices, and those filters determine response. Most of the time, people are observed through expectation, labels, roles, assumptions formed long before the present moment. But when those filters weaken, even slightly, something interesting happens. Response becomes more neutral, more precise, less reactive, not kinder, not harsher, just clearer. You may have noticed this when you stopped explaining yourself as much, when you responded without urgency, when you allowed silence to exist without filling it. That silence isn't empty, it's informative, and systems pay attention to it. This is where people often get confused. They think awareness is about control, about directing outcomes, about shaping reality through intention. But awareness doesn't direct, it reveals, and revealed things behave differently than hidden ones, not because they are forced to, but because uncertainty has less room to operate. Consider how you respond when someone speaks slowly and deliberately, not trying to convince you, not asking for agreement, just stating what they see. You listen differently. Your nervous system adjusts. Your expectations soften. Your response becomes less defensive, less automatic. That's observation influencing response. Now apply that outward. When you observe without performing, without trying to be understood, without rushing toward resolution, you change the field of interaction. Again, not dramatically, not visibly, but measurably. People may not articulate it. They may not even notice it consciously, but something registers. This is why the title matters. You're not changing, you're being observed differently, and often that shift begins when you stop insisting on being seen a certain way. There's a quiet confidence in not correcting every misunderstanding, in letting some impressions remain incomplete, in allowing others to encounter you without guidance. That confidence isn't dominance, it isn't detachment, it's stability, and stability is easy to observe. This doesn't mean withdrawing. It doesn't mean silence at all costs. It doesn't mean becoming distant or passive. It means speaking when there's something to add, not something to prove. It means noticing how often response is driven by anticipation rather than necessity. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. You may start to notice patterns, how certain environments feel louder than others, how some conversations drain attention while others refine it, how your presence feels different, depending on whether you are monitoring reaction or simply noticing it. That's not mysticism, it's cognitive load. When you stop managing perception, you free attention, and attention is detectable. This is why some people feel grounded without trying, why others feel intense without being expressive, why a room can feel calm even when nothing has changed physically. Observation reorganizes interaction, and here's where it becomes subtle. The more clearly you observe, the less you interfere, and the less you interfere, the more accurate the response becomes. Not favorable, not unfavorable. Accurate. Accuracy is underrated, but it's the foundation of trust. People trust what behaves consistently, what doesn't rush, what doesn't overreact. They may not admire it, they may not comment on it, but they adjust around it. That adjustment can feel like respect, or distance, or curiosity. None of those are goals. They're byproducts, and this is where many misunderstand. They try to recreate the byproduct instead of maintaining the observation. They perform calm instead of practicing attention. They adopt language instead of refining awareness. And the system detects that immediately, because performance is low. Even when it's subtle, observation is quiet, even when it's intense. If you've noticed that things feel slightly slower lately, not in time but in reaction, that's often the sign. Moments stretch just enough for choice to appear. You don't rush to respond. You don't rush to explain. You notice the space. And space invites recalibration. This doesn't make life easier. It makes it clearer. And clarity can feel unsettling at first, because clarity removes the comfort of narratives, of assuming why things happen, of telling yourself stories about control or lack of it. Instead, you see interaction as it is, responsive, adaptive, neutral. And neutrality is powerful because it doesn't demand agreement. It simply persists. Now, here's the part that's often overlooked. Being observed differently doesn't always feel positive. Sometimes it feels like distance, like people don't project as much onto you, like situations resolve without drama, but also without validation. That can feel unfamiliar, because attention without emotional charge can feel empty if you're used to intensity. But emptiness, in this sense, is space. And space allows accurate movement. This is why nothing here is a technique, nothing to practice aggressively, nothing to implement as a strategy. The moment you try to use observation, it stops being observation. It becomes intent, and intent narrows perception. So instead, you notice how often you want to jump ahead, how often you want to label a moment as good or bad, how often you want to intervene before understanding stabilizes. And sometimes you let that impulse pass, not because it's wrong, but because it's informative. Over time, this changes how you are read, not because you changed who you are, but because fewer assumptions are triggered around you, and assumptions drive response. This is not about becoming invisible, it's about becoming legible. Legible systems are easier to interact with. They create less friction. They don't require excessive interpretation. That's why things may feel smoother lately, or quieter, or less charged. And if that's happening, there's nothing to chase, nothing to enhance, just something to continue noticing. If you're still here listening, that's already happening. And if this way of observing resonates, not as an idea, but as a recognition, you may want to stay connected to this channel, not because it will tell you what to do, but because it gives space to notice how observation itself works. You can subscribe if you want to continue exploring this perspective, slowly, calmly, without pressure. And for now, you don't need to conclude anything. Just notice how this lands, what stays, what fades, because understanding doesn't always arrive as an answer. Sometimes it arrives as a quieter question that keeps observing long after the words end.